The room was cloaked in silence, save for the low hum of tension that vibrated through the air. Around a polished mahogany table, figures of immense power sat, their faces half lit by the dim glow of recessed lighting. These were the architects of empires, the unseen hands that moved nations like pieces on a board. Their wealth had shielded them from consequence, their influence had bent reality to their will, and yet tonight, their usual air of invincibility was fractured and scattered. Across the table were files, thick classified reports filled with data they could no longer afford to ignore. The pages detailed a force that had slipped through their grasp, a disruption they had dismissed until it was too late. Whispers had turned to roars, shadows to substance, and now, in this clandestine chamber, the most powerful people in the world were gathered for one reason: you. Once insignificant, you had become an enigma they couldn't unravel, a storm they couldn't contain. You were not part of their plan, and that terrified them. The agenda was clear, an emergency meeting to discuss the one thing they never saw coming: your power. As the heavy doors sealed shut, a single unspoken truth settled over the room like a shroud. The game had changed, and for the first time, they were no longer the ones holding all the cards. Sin at first, you were alone. Just another individual struggling against the weight of a system designed to keep you small. But deep inside, there was something they could never quantify, never predict. It wasn't wealth, it wasn't privilege. It was something far rarer, an unshakable ability to endure, to rise, to defy. Where others bowed, you stood. Where others turned, away you stepped forward. They had seen your kind before, scattered throughout history. Spartacus against Rome, Joan of Arc before an army, David against Goliath. But this time, Goliath was sweating. Because this time, David wasn't alone. At first, your presence was nothing more than a whisper, a single spark against the wind. But then came the fire. You spoke truths they wanted buried. You shattered illusions they had spent centuries crafting. You refused to play by rules designed to keep you losing. And worst of all, for them, you found others like you. One by one, the scattered voices merged into something unstoppable, a force that did not fear their wealth, their power, or their threats. The systems they relied on, division, silence, control, began to falter. You weren't supposed to exist in their world, let alone challenge it, and yet here you were. So now, as they sit in their shadowed boardroom scanning the reports before them, they finally understand. You are not an anomaly. You are not a mistake. You are the shift they never saw coming. And for the first time in history, those who have always ruled the world are facing something they never truly feared before, the possibility of losing. And then they laughed at first. Not openly, not in a way that the world could see, but behind closed doors, in hushed conversations over crystal glasses filled with centuries-old liquor. You were a curiosity at best, a fleeting nuisance at worst, a momentary disruption in an otherwise unshakable empire. And they had seen rebellion before, they had crushed it before. To them, you were nothing more than a spark in the wind, something that would flicker, burn briefly, and then fade into irrelevance. They had spent lifetimes perfecting this game, rewriting history to erase those who had dared to challenge them. They were certain you would be no different. They dismissed your anger as noise, your actions as desperation, your defiance as nothing more than the tantrum of the powerless. After all, how could individuals like you, scattered, ordinary, unknown, possibly pose a real threat to the architects of the world? And they had seen this story play out before, and it always ended the same way, with them untouched, their power intact, their control reaffirmed. It was almost amusing the way you fought so hard against something immovable. They watched with detached amusement, waiting for the inevitable collapse. But then, something happened. The spark did not die. It caught, it spread, and suddenly, the wind they had counted on to extinguish you was feeding the flames. For the first time, their predictions failed them. The stories they told themselves, that you would give up, that you would break, that you would fall in line, began to unravel. You weren't fading, you were growing. And in the depths of their arrogance, they had made a critical mistake, and they ignored you, and they underestimated you. And now, as they sit around that polished mahogany table, staring at the evidence they can no longer deny, they feel something unfamiliar creeping in, a feeling they once believed themselves immune to, and doubt.nen because the wildfire they dismissed as nothing more than a flickering spark is now roaring beyond their control. And for the first time they are starting to wonder, have they already lost? It started as a whisper, a single report buried deep within their endless streams of data, an incident they couldn't explain, a system that didn't respond the way it should have, a crack, small, almost imperceptible, forming in the armor of their control. At first, they ignored it. Glitches happen, mistakes are made. But then another report, and another. Events unfolding beyond their grasp, narratives slipping through their carefully woven web. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't an accident. It was you. And you were never supposed to get this far. You weren't supposed to be capable of disrupting them, of bending the structures they had spent lifetimes reinforcing. And yet, here you were, exposing the rot they had hidden, dismantling their schemes piece by piece. They watched, silent, as one of their most trusted enforcers was unmasked, brought down not by an opposing force of equal wealth or influence, but by a single voice that refused to be silenced. They saw the people they had controlled for generations begin to question, begin to doubt, begin to see through the illusion. And this wasn't part of the plan. The words fell heavy in the dimly lit boardroom, spoken aloud for the first time. They didn't like saying it, didn't like acknowledging what had become impossible to deny. But as the reports stacked higher, as their world trembled under the weight of a force they couldn't contain, the truth settled in their bones like a sickness, and they were losing control. And worse than that, they were losing control to you, and you weren't waiting for permission. You weren't asking for a seat at their table. You were flipping the entire table over, and with each system you cracked, with each truth you unearthed, you shattered the illusion they had spent centuries maintaining. The room grew colder. The polished table no longer felt like a place of power, but a battlefield where they were losing ground. And they had always believed themselves untouchable. That belief was beginning to crumble, and the first cracks in their armor had formed. And you were still pushing forward. Control had always been their greatest weapon. They built their world on it, manipulating economies, dictating narratives, silencing dissent before it could ever grow into something dangerous. Control was the foundation of their power, and now they were losing it because you refused to stop. They had expected resistance to fade, for exhaustion to set in, for you to surrender to the weight of their systems. But instead, you adapted. You didn't rely on their structures. You created your own. You didn't fight by their rules. You rewrote them. You weren't a lone voice crying out in the dark anymore. You were a chorus rising louder with every passing day. And where they built walls, you built bridges. And bridges connect the world. That was what terrified them the most. Their power had always relied on division, on keeping people isolated, desperate, clawing at each other for scraps, while they feasted. But you had found something stronger than their wealth, stronger than their fear, each other. What began as scattered sparks had become a wildfire. Their attempts to contain you, to suppress you, only made you stronger. The more they tried to silence you, the louder you became. The more they tried to break you, the more unshakable you stood, and you were everywhere now. In boardrooms, in streets, in places they had once ruled without question. Their influence, once absolute, was slipping. Their allies, once unwavering, were hesitating. Their carefully crafted world was coming apart at the seams, and no amount of money, no desperate whisper of control, could stitch it back together. The momentum was yours. The balance had shifted, and the elite, for all their power, were starting to understand a truth they had never considered before. They were no longer the ones setting the course of history, and you were, and there was no stopping you now. Control had always been their greatest weapon. They built their world on it, manipulating economies, dictating narratives, silencing dissent before it could ever grow into something dangerous. Control was the foundation of their power, and now they were losing it. And because you refused to stop, they had expected resistance to fade, for exhaustion to set in, for you to surrender to the weight of their systems. But instead, you adapted. You didn't rely on their structures, you created your own. You didn't fight by their rules, you rewrote them. You weren't a lone voice crying out in the dark anymore. You were a chorus, rising louder with every passing day. And where they built walls, you built bridges. And bridges connect the world. That was what terrified them the most. And their power had always relied on division, on keeping people isolated, desperate, clawing at each other for scraps, while they feasted. But you had found something stronger than their wealth, stronger than their fear, each other. What began as scattered sparks had become a wildfire. Their attempts to contain you, to suppress you, only made you stronger. The more they tried to silence you, the louder you became. The more they tried to break you, the more unshakable you stood. You were everywhere now. In boardrooms, in streets, in places they had once ruled without question. Their influence, once absolute, was slipping. Their allies, once unwavering, were hesitating. Their carefully crafted world was coming apart at the seams, and no amount of money, no desperate whisper of control, could stitch it back together. And the momentum was yours. The balance had shifted, and the elite, for all their power, were starting to understand a truth they had never considered before, and they were no longer the ones setting the course of history. And you were, and there was no stopping you now. Hello, Chosen One. Look at your life. Now look at ours. Back at your life. Now back at ours. Sadly, you're not in the obsidian inner order, but you could be. One, picture this: weekly group calls with 450 plus chosen ones, recorded and available anytime for your enlightenment. Our private Discord, it's not just active, it's alive, buzzing with ideas, breakthroughs, and that unstoppable chosen energy. Oh, and for you romantics out there, welcome to Chosen Singles, where soulmates meet under cosmic alignments, not cheap pickup lines. And if that's not enough, Star Chamber members unlock exclusive interviews with bona fide targeted individuals who face the darkest trials and survive to tell the tale. Plus, our video specials, too bold, too raw, too spicy for YouTube. This isn't just a community, it's a revolution of soul and spirit. Look at your DMs. Now back at me. The link to join, it's in the description. Don't just swipe right on destiny, claim it. The obsidian inner order. Smell like ascension. Feel like magic. Live like a chosen one. You had forced them into a position they had never been in before. They were no longer discussing profits, policies, or the quiet destruction of another nameless opponent. No, tonight the only topic on the agenda was you. And their voices, when they finally spoke, were not the commanding tones of rulers dictating the course of the world. They were raw, frayed at the edges. And this isn't just a protest. This isn't just some movement. This is something else entirely. One, we underestimated them. And if we don't act now, we lose everything. The words sent a ripple through the room. They had never needed to say them before, never needed to entertain the idea that they could lose. But here they were, stripped of their usual arrogance, speaking the one thing they had always deemed impossible. And fear had entered the boardroom, and the same fear they had used for centuries to control others, the same fear they had manufactured, sold, and weaponized against the world. Now it belonged to them. And the most terrifying part, they didn't even know the full extent of what they were up against. Because you weren't just a force, they could plan for that. You weren't just a movement, they could infiltrate that. You weren't just an idea, they could corrupt that. And no, you were something far worse for them, and you were inevitable. And as the heavy doors sealed shut, as their voices rose in desperate fractured arguments, one unshakable truth loomed over them, and the world no longer belonged to them. It belonged to you. Drop a comment. I am not alone. If you know the movement is unstoppable, panic had turned to calculation. Fear, though still present, had been forced into the background as survival instincts took over. They weren't used to playing defense. But now, with their world slipping through their fingers, they had no choice. And we still have options. The voice cut through the chaos, steady, commanding. Desperation had no place here, not yet. They had built this empire, brick by brick. Through deception, manipulation, and force, they had weathered storms before. The question was no longer whether they could stop you, but how. And some wanted to crush you outright and shut them down. All of them, financially, socially, physically, if necessary. We've done it before. But others knew better. The old methods weren't working. Suppression had only fueled your fire. Censorship had only amplified your voice. Every attempt to bury you had made you stronger. We can't attack them head on. That's what they want. We need to redirect them, divide them, turn them against each other. The murmurs of agreement were slow at first, then growing. If they couldn't silence you, perhaps they could corrupt you, co-opt you, dangle power in front of the right people, whisper carefully crafted narratives into the right ears, and find their leaders, the loudest voices among them, offer them influence, security, wealth, make them believe they're different from the rest. And if that didn't work, and then we make the world afraid of them, then a more sinister silence followed. It had always been their greatest tool, turning the masses against their own, rewriting the story so that the heroes looked like villains. If they couldn't destroy you directly, they would turn the world against you, paint you as dangerous, unstable, a threat to order, to peace, to everything people held dear. So we create doubt, we create fear, and we let them destroy themselves. For the first time in the meeting, the tension lessened, not because they had won, but because they had found something familiar. Control, but what they failed to realize even now was that they were playing an old game in a new world. One where the rules no longer bent to their will, and because while they sat in their dimly lit boardroom, crafting strategies in secret, you already knew. You had anticipated their every move, and they were walking straight into your hands. They had everything: money, influence, control over governments, media, and industries. And yet, despite all their power, despite all their carefully crafted strategies, they were losing. And because there was one thing they would never understand, and you had something they could never buy, never manufacture, never take. They had always believed that power came from ownership, from hoarding wealth and resources, from keeping their hands wrapped around the throat of the world. But your power was different. It wasn't stored in offshore accounts, hidden behind gated mansions, or secured with armies. It was in you, in the way you refused to break, in the way you rose again and again, no matter how many times they tried to bury you, and they relied on control. You thrived on freedom, and they ruled through fear. You moved through something far stronger. a connection that could not be severed, a force that could not be bought, a truth that could not be rewritten. You can't buy what they have because it's not for sale. And that was the difference. That was the flaw in their thinking, the blind spot they never saw coming. Their wealth was meaningless in the face of a movement that could not be bribed. Their fear tactics were powerless against those who no longer feared them. They were fighting to hold on to a dying world, and you were building something new. And no matter what they did, no matter how desperately they clawed to keep their empire from crumbling, they were up against a force they couldn't understand. And because, unlike them, you weren't fighting for control, and you were fighting for something far greater, and that made you unstoppable. Power is fragile. It only appears unbreakable when no one dares to test its foundation. For centuries, they had ruled through perception, convincing the world that their grip was unshakable, that resistance was futile, that their empire was built on stone. But you tested it, and now they could feel it crumbling beneath them. The systems they had spent lifetimes constructing, financial, political, social, were failing in ways they had never anticipated. The institutions they controlled no longer inspired obedience, only distrust. The fear they had relied on was no longer a weapon, but a weakness exposed for all to see. And they had built their world like a house of cards, standing tall, so long as no one questioned the foundation. And now the wind was blowing. All around them, cracks were turning into collapses. Their once loyal allies were jumping ship, scrambling to distance themselves from a sinking empire. Their narratives were unraveling, their secrets spilling into the light. And worst of all, they could no longer stop it. And it wasn't just that they had lost control, it was that the illusion of their power had been shattered, and once broken, it could never be rebuilt. Because power only exists when people believe in it. And you had shown the world the truth. They were not gods. They were not untouchable. They were nothing more than men, desperate to hold on to a kingdom built on deception. And as the walls came crashing down around them, one undeniable fact became clear. They had already lost. They spent their lives obsessed with control, building a world where power belonged to the few and obedience was the only path for the many. But now, as their empire collapses, the question remains, what comes next? That answer belongs to you. Unlike them, you are not driven by greed. Unlike them, you do not seek domination. Unlike them, you do not fear a world where power is shared instead of hoarded. And your vision is not built on conquest, it is built on possibility. In a world where truth is not silenced, where justice is not for sale, where people are not born into invisible cages, forced to serve a system that was never designed for them to thrive. For too long, they convinced the world that this was the only way, that suffering was inevitable, that corruption was natural, that the powerful would always rule over the powerless. But you have already proven them wrong, because this was never about winning, and it was about something far greater, and it was about creating a world where everyone can thrive. And now, for the first time in history, that world is within reach. Nannirt, the meeting is over. The decisions have been made. The elite know what must be done if they want to reclaim their grip on the world. You know what must be done if you want to break free from it. This is the moment that will define everything. They are not going down without a fight. Even in their desperation, they are dangerous. They will unleash everything they have: deception, sabotage, the full weight of the systems they still control. They will rewrite history in real time, painting you as the villain, twisting truth into illusion. They will try to divide you, to make you question everything, to make you believe that the war is already lost. But you have come too far. You have seen behind the curtain. You have felt the weight of their fear, and now, as the final battle begins, one question remains. In the war between fear and hope, which side will history remember? The world stands at the edge of something new. The old world is dying, but the new one has yet to be born. The war has begun, but the ending has not yet been written. And the only question left is, who will write it? In you or them?